In this video, I will show you how to create, read, update and delete clients using Spring Boot and Thymeleaf. We will not use GPA repositories, but we will use JDBC and SQL queries. So here we have the list of clients, and to create a new client, we can click on this button. Then let's fill the form. Then submit. So because the last name is required, we have this validation error. So let's provide the last name. Then submit. So here we can see that we have a new client. And to update the data of this client, we can click on the edit button. So let's update the email address, the phone number and the address. Then submit. And here we can see that the email address, the phone number and the address have been updated. And to delete a client, we can click on this delete button. So here we have this alert. If we click on cancel, nothing happens. And if we click on OK, the client will be deleted. Then in the second video, I will show you how to implement the pagination functionality. You can find the video link in the description. Now let's create a new Spring Boot project. So we can go to Spring Initializer. So let's select Maven, let's select the latest version of Spring Boot. And for the group, we can write com.bmt, for example. Then let's provide a name to this project. We can call it My Store. Then let's add the dependencies. So the first dependency is Spring Web. So this dependency allows us to create web applications. Then we need Thymeleaf. So this dependency allows us to create dynamic HTML pages. Then we need the validation dependency. So using this dependency, we can check if the submitted data is valid or not. Then we will connect to MySQL database. So we need the MySQL driver. So in this video, we will connect to the database using JDBC. So here we can type JDBC. Then we can select JDBC API dependency or Spring Data JDBC. But in this video, I will use JDBC that is available with Spring Data GPA. So here we can type GPA. And let's select this dependency. Then we can add another dependency which is called DevTools. So with this dependency, the application will restart automatically after every modification. So this is optional, but it is useful. So let's select it. Now let's download the project. So I will save it on the desktop. Now let's extract this zip file and let's open it using an IDE. I will open it using Eclipse. Now let's configure the application to connect to the database. So let's open the file application.properties and let's add the required properties. So we can add the driver class name. Then here we have the URL of the database, so we will connect to the database called DB1. Of course, we need to create this database. Then this is the username, and here I don't have any password. Now let's create this database. So I will use XAMPP that includes MySQL. So using XAMPP, we can connect to the database using phpMyAdmin. So let's click on Admin, and let's create a new database. So let's call it DB1. And here we can see that we have this new database. Now let's save the file and let's close it. Now let's create a new controller. So let's add a new class. And let's add it in the controllers package. Let's call it home controller. And let's add the controller annotation. Then let's create the root endpoint. So when we send a request to the root URL using the get method, we will execute the index method and we will return the page index.html. So now we need to create this page. But first, let's add the required package. Then let's create the page index.html, and we need to create it in the templates folder. So I will create this page using Bootstrap. So let's go to the documentation website of Bootstrap. Let's go to the first link, then docs, and let's copy this source code that includes Bootstrap CSS and JavaScript from the CDN. Let's paste it here. Let's change the title of the window. So here we can write my store, for example. Then let's delete this h1 element. And let's replace it with this container that contains this h1 element that will be displayed in the center of the page. So here we can write welcome to our website. Let's save all the files and let's run the application. So we can go to the main file, we can make a right click, then run as, then Java application. So now the application is running correctly and it is available at this port number. Let's go to the browser, and here let's write localhost 8080. And we obtain this page. So now let's add the navbar and let's add the footer. So to add the navbar, we can go back to the documentation website of Bootstrap, and under components, let's click on navbar. Then let's copy the source code that allows us to obtain this navbar. And let's add it after the body. Let's change the name of the application. So here we can write my store. And let's change the URL. So it will be the root URL. Then let's add a bottom border to the navbar. So just here, we can add the Bootstrap class border bottom. And then we can use a container instead of container fluid to add some space at the left and at the right. So here we can see that we have the home item. Let's keep it, but let's delete this attribute. We don't need it. Let's change the href. So here it will be the root URL, and we can change the classes. So let's delete the active class and let's replace it with text dark. Then we have this item. So let's change the text. So here we can write contact, for example. Let's change the URL. So it will be /contact. And let's add text dark to the class. We can add another item for the privacy page. So let's copy this item and let's paste it here. Let's change the text. So let's write privacy. Let's change the URL. Then let's delete this item. So let's delete this li element. Let's delete this item as well. And let's delete this form. Let's save the file. And let's refresh the page. And here we can see that we have this navbar. Now let's add the footer. So after this div that contains the title of the application, we can create the footer. So in this footer, we will add a top border, and then we have this div, which is a Bootstrap container, where we will display the copyright, and then we will display the current year. So we can call dates that allow us to display the date, and we will display only the year. And here we have the name of the application. Let's save the file. And let's refresh the page. And we obtain this footer. Now we need the navbar and the footer to be shared between all the pages of the application, so we can move them in a different file. So let's create a new file under templates. And we can call it layout.html, for example. Now let's copy the source code from the index page, so we can copy all the file. Let's paste it here. So we need to share the head element, the nav element, and the footer element. So let's provide the head with a name. So we can add th fragment attribute and the value will be page head, for example. Here we can see that we have a warning, so this is not an error. But to get rid of this warning, we can add another attribute in the HTML element. So just here we can add the following attribute. And here we can see that we don't have the warning anymore. Also, we need to provide the nav element with a name. So just here, we can add th fragment attribute and we can call it page navbar, for example. Let's delete this div, we don't need it. And let's provide a name to the footer element. And we can call it page footer. So now we can use the shared elements in the other pages. So let's go back to the index page. Let's delete the content of the head element. And let's use the shared head element. So just here in the open tag, we can add th replace and we will replace this head element with the head element having the name page head that is defined in the layout file. So here we have this warning. To get rid of this, we can add the Thymeleaf attribute in the HTML element. So page head that we have here is this page head. So we will replace this head element with the content of this head element. Now let's do the same thing with this nav element. So let's delete the content of this nav element. So we can also delete the attributes. Then let's delete the content. And you can replace the content of this nav element with the content of the nav element having the name page navbar that is defined in the layout file. Then let's do the same thing with the footer. So let's delete the attributes. Then let's delete the content. Then let's add th replace and we will replace the content of this footer with the content of the footer having the name page footer of the layout file. We can also update the text of this h1 element. So here we can write, welcome to our new website. Let's save all the files. And let's refresh the page. And here we can see that we are using the navbar and the footer that are defined in the layout file. Now let's create the contact page and the privacy page. So first let's go to home controller. Then let's define two additional routes. So we can create the route /contact that is accessible using the get method and the route /privacy that is also accessible using the get method. So when we send a request to /contact, we will display the contact page. And when we send a request to /privacy, we will display the privacy page. So now let's create the files contact.html and privacy.html. Let's create them in the templates folder. So for the file contact.html, we can copy the source code of the index page. So we can copy this. Then let's change the text of the h1 element. So here we can write contact us, for example. Let's create the privacy page. And here we can write privacy. Now let's save all the files. Let's go to the contact page. So here we have /contact and this is the contact page. Let's go to the privacy page. So here we can see that all the pages are sharing the navbar and the footer. Now let's create a new class that will be used to store the client details. Let's create it in the models package. And let's call it client. Then let's define the different fields of this class. So we need the client ID, the first name, the last name, the email address, the phone number, the address, and created at, which is the date of creating the client. Then let's create the getters and setters. Let's select all the fields, then generate. Then let's create the clients table in the database. So let's go to phpMyAdmin, and in DB1 let's create a new table. We can create it using an SQL query. So this first query allows us to create the clients table. So we will create the client ID, which is the primary key, and it is auto-incremental. Then we have the first name, last name, the email address that should be unique. Then we have the phone number, the address, and the date, and by default created at will be the current date. Then we will insert into the clients table, we will insert these rows. So now to execute these two queries, we can click on Go. And here we can see that we have this new table. Let's click on it, and we have these rows. Now let's create a new class that allows us to read and write the clients in the database. So this class is a repository, so we can create it in the repositories package. And let's call it ClientsRepository. Then let's register this class as a component. So just here we can annotate it with @component or @service or @repository. But because this is a repository, we can annotate it with @repository. Then we need to request a service from the application, which is of type JDBC template, that allows us to read and write the clients using SQL queries. So just here we can use AutoWired. Then let's create the first method that allows us to read all the clients from the database. We can call it getClients, and it returns a list of client objects. So here we can create an empty list and we can return it. Let's import the required packages. Then let's read the clients from the database. So first we can create this SQL query. So we will read all the columns from the clients table, and we will sort the clients by descending order of ID. Like this, we will read the newest clients first. Then we need to execute this query. So we can call JDBC template.query for row set, and this is the SQL query. And we obtain an object of type SQL row set. Then for every row that we have in the database, we need to create an object of type client, and we need to add it to the clients list. So for every row that we have in this object, we will create an object of type client. We will set the client ID, the first name, the last name, the email address, the phone number, the address, and the date using the data that is available in the rows object. Then we will add the client object to this list, and we will return this list. Now let's create another method that allows us to read a client by ID. So we can call it getClient, and it returns the client, and here we will provide it with the client ID. So the SQL query will be select all the columns from the clients table where the client ID is equal to question mark. So question mark will be replaced by the value of this ID. Then here we can call JDBC template.query for row set. This is the SQL query, and this is the ID that will replace the value of this question mark. So we will obtain an object of type SQL row, and we will check if we have a client or not. So if rows.next, this means that we have a client having this ID. In this case, we will create an object of type client, and we will set the data of this client, and we will return it. Otherwise, if we don't have a client with this ID, then we will return null. So this method allows us to read a client by ID. We can also create another method that allows us to read the client by email address, because the email address should be unique. So we can copy the first method. and let's paste it here. Let's replace the type of the parameter, so it is string, and let's call it email. Let's update the SQL query, so we will read the client having the email address equal to this email address. So this is the name of the column in the database, and let's replace this question mark by the value of this variable. Then let's create a new method that allows us to create clients. We can call it create client, and it requires the client that will be created, and it returns the client that has been created. And by default, we will return null if we have any error. Then we need the SQL query that allows us to create a new client. So we will insert into the clients table, we will insert the first name, the last name, the email address, the phone number, the address, and created at. And the values will be these question marks that we need to replace with the data of the client. So then we will execute gdbc template.update. So this is the SQL query that we will execute. And these are the values that will replace the different question marks that we have here. So count allows us to obtain the number of the created rows. So if count is greater than 0, this means that we created the client successfully. So we can return the data of the created client. So we can execute gdbc template.query for object. So this will return an object, and the type of the object will be an integer. So we will return an integer. And the query that we want to execute is select last insert ID. So this allows us to read the ID of the last created client. So we will obtain the ID, which is the ID of the created client. And we will return getClient, and we will provide it with the ID of the client. So if count is greater than 0, we will return the created client. Otherwise, we will return null. Then let's create another method that allows us to update clients. We can call it update client. It requires the client that we need to update, and it returns the updated client. So this is the SQL query. We will update the clients table, and we will update the first name, the last name, the email address, the phone number, the address, the date, where the client ID is equal to the ID that we have in this object. Then we need to execute this SQL query. So we can call gdbc template.update. This is the query. And here we have the data that will replace the different question marks. Then we will return the updated client. So we can call getClient, and we will provide it with the ID of the client. Then let's create another method that allows us to delete clients by ID. We can call it delete client, and it requires the client ID. So this is the SQL query, delete from clients, where the client ID is equal to this question mark. So we need to replace question mark by the client ID. So we can execute gdbc template, then update. This is the SQL query, and this is the client ID. Now let's create the page that allows us to display the available clients. So first let's create a new controller. And let's call it clients controller. Let's annotate it with the controller annotation. Then let's define the main URL of this controller. So let's add @request mapping. So this controller will be accessible at URLs that start with /clients. Then let's request clients repository from the application. So we can use @autowired. Then let's create the first route that allows us to display the available clients. We can call it getClients. So it will be accessible using the get method at the URL /clients. So here we will read the clients from the database using our repository. So we can call getClients, and we will obtain a list of client objects. Then we will add this list to the model. Like this, it will be accessible to the page. And we will return the page index.html that we need to create in the clients folder, that we need also to create in the templates folder. Let's add the required packages. Let's create the clients folder. Then let's create the file index.html. Then we can copy the source code of this file from the file index.html that we have in the templates folder. So let's copy this code and let's paste it here. Let's change the title. So we can write list of clients. Then let's add a button that should allow us to create new clients. So we can add this button, add client, that will take us to the URL /clients/create. So we did not create this route yet, but later we need to create it. Then let's create an HTML table. So we can create this table, which is a bootstrap table. In the table head we have this row that contains these columns. So we will display the client ID, the name, the email address, the phone number, the address, the date, and action. So in this column, the action column, we will display two buttons, the edit button and the delete button. Then here we have the table body. So the table body is empty. And for every client that we have in the clients list, we will create a table row. So this is the table row. And we will create a table row for every client that we have in the clients list. So we will display the client ID. In the second column, we will display the name. So we will display the first name plus space plus last name. Then we will display the email address, the phone number, the address, the date. So we will not display the full value of the date, but we will display only the first 10 characters. So we will display the year, then the month, then the day. Then here we have the last cell. So this cell contains two buttons, the edit button and the delete button. So when we click on edit, we will go to the URL /clients/edit and we will provide this page with the ID of the client. So this route does not exist for the moment and later we need to create it. And when we click on delete, we will display a confirmation message. If the user clicks on yes, then we will send a request to the URL /clients/delete and we will provide the delete page with the ID of the client. Now let's add a link to this page in the navbar. So let's go to the layout file and let's create a new item. So we can copy this item and let's paste it here. Here we can write clients and the URL will be /clients. Now let's save all the files. And because we are using the DevTools dependency, we can see that the application restarts automatically. Let's refresh the page and let's click on clients. So here we have all the available clients. Now I will show you how to create clients. So when we click on add client, we will send a request to the URL /clients/create. So we need to create this route. First, let's create a new model that allows the user to send the client details. So we will not use the client model because it contains fields that should not be provided by the user. So let's create a new model. And let's call it client.DTU. So this model will be very similar to the client model. So we need the first name, the last name, the email address, the phone number, and the address. So we can copy these fields from here. And let's add them here. Also, let's add the validation annotations that allow us to check if the submitted data is valid or not. So the first name is required, and if we don't provide the first name, we can display the error message. The first name is required. Let's add this annotation. And let's do the same thing with the last name. So it is required. Let's do the same thing with the email address. But for the email address, it should also have the email address format. So just here we can add @email. So to fix the error, we can delete the name of this annotation and let's replace it with star. And for the phone number, we can suppose that it is optional, so we don't need to annotate it with any validation annotation. And also let's suppose that the address is optional. Now let's create the getters and setters. Then let's create a new route in clients controller that allows us to display the page that allows the user to create new clients. So we can create this route that is accessible at the URL /clients/create, and it is accessible using the HTTP GET method. So here we have the method showCreatePage, and we will return the create.html page that we need to create in the clients folder. Let's add the required package, and let's create the create page. So let's create it in the clients folder. Let's copy the source code from the index page, and let's paste it here. Let's delete this h1 element, and let's replace it with this row. So this is a bootstrap row that contains one column that will be displayed in the center of the page. Also, we can add a rounded border, we can add some paddings and some margin. Then here we can display the title new client, and you can display it in the center of the page. Then let's create the form. So this form will be submitted using the post method to the same URL, which is /clients/create, and it is associated to the object client.dto that we have in the module. So client.dto is this object. Then let's create the first field of this form. So we can create this div, which is a bootstrap row. In the first column we have this label with the text first name, and in the second column we have this div. So we have this input field that is associated to the first name field of client.dto. So first name is this field. Then we have this paragraph that will be only displayed if we have an error. So if we have a validation error related to the first name field of the client.dto object, then we will display the error related to the first name. So we will display this error using the red color because we are using this bootstrap class. Then let's add the other fields of this form. So we can create this row that allows us to set the last name, and we have this input field that is associated to the last name field of client.dto, and we have this paragraph to display any validation error related to the last name. Then we have another row for the email address. We have this input field that is associated to the email field of client.dto. Then we have this row for the phone number, and we have this row for the address. Then let's add another row for the submit button and the cancel button. So in this row we have two columns. This is the first column that has the submit button. So this is the button that allows us to submit the form. And we have this second column that has the cancel button. So when we click on cancel, we will go to this URL /clients. So we will display the list of clients. Now let's save all the files. Let's go to the browser. Then let's click on add client. And we obtain this form, but here we have this useless character. So we need just to correct the source code. So here we have in the form element, you can see that we have this additional character. Let's delete it and let's save the file. Let's refresh the page. So when we click on cancel, we have the list of clients. And when we click on submit, we have this error. So now we need to create a new route that will process post requests at this URL. So let's go to clients controller and let's create a new route. So we can create this new route. It is accessible at the URL /clients/create using the HTTP post method. So we can create this method. It requires the submitted data of the form that is available in this object, and we need to check if the submitted data is valid or not. So we need to add this annotation and this object. And because the email address should be unique in the database, we need first to check if the submitted email address is already used or not. So we can call a repo, which is our repository.getClient, and we will provide this method with the submitted email address that is available in client.dtu. So if getClient returns a client, this means that the email address is already used. In this case, we can add an error to this object. So we need to add an error which is of type field error. So it will be an error related to this object. That's why here we have client.dtu, and it is related to the email field of client.dtu. So we will display the submitted value of the email address, and this is the error message. Email address is already used. Then let's check if we have any validation error. So if we have any validation error, then we will return the create page. So this page will display the submitted data and the validation errors. Otherwise, we need to create a new client. So we can create an object of type client. We will set the first name, last name, the email address, the phone number, and the address using the submitted data which is available in client.dtu. Then we will set the date of creating this client. So it will be the current date. So new date allows us to read the current date. And using this class, we will read the current date using this format. Then we will save the client in the database using our repository, and we will redirect the user to the URL /clients. Let's save the file. Let's click on Add Client, and let's submit the form. So here we can see that we have validation errors related to the first name, last name, and the email address. But we don't have any validation error with the phone number and the address because they are optional. Now let's fill the form, then submit. And here we still have this validation error because the email address is not valid. So now let's provide a valid email address. Then submit. And you can see that we have this new client. Now I will show you how to update the client details. So when we click on Edit, we will send a request to the route /clients/edit, and we will provide it with the client ID. So now let's create this route. So let's go to clients controller and let's create a new route. So we can create this route that is accessible using the HTTP GET method, and the show edit page requires the model. Then we need to read the ID from the URL. Then we need to find a client having this ID. So here we can use our repository and we can call the method getClient. So if client is null, we will redirect the user to the list of clients. Otherwise, we need to add this client to the model. Like this, it will be accessible to the page. And we need to create an object of type client.dtu that we will associate to the form. So we can add this object to the model, and it will be accessible using the name client. Then we can create an object of type client.dtu, and we will set the first name, last name, the email address, the phone number, and the address using the data of this object. And we will add this object client.dtu to the model. Like this, it will be accessible to the page, and we can associate it to the form. Now let's create the edit page. So let's create it in the clients folder. So the source code of the edit page will be very similar to the source code of the create page. So let's copy this code and let's paste it here. Let's change the title. So here we can write edit client. Then in the form, let's add another row to display the client ID. So we can copy this div. Let's change the text. So here we can write ID. We don't need this paragraph, so let's delete it. Then we don't need to submit the data of this input field. So we don't need the th field attribute, and we need to replace this with th value. Then we will display the client ID that is available in the client object. So here we can delete this. And let's write client.id. Also, this input field should be of type read-only. So just here we can add read-only. And let's change the bootstrap class. Also, we need to display the date of creating this client. So we can copy this div and let's paste it after the address. So here we can write created at, and in the th value let's display the date. Now let's save all the files and let's refresh the page. And we obtain this form with the client details. So if we click on cancel, we have the list of clients. Let's click on edit again, then submit. So now let's create a new route that will process post requests at this URL. So let's go to clients controller and let's create a new route. So we can create this method update client, and it is accessible at the URL /clients/edit using the post method. So this method requires the model that allows us to send data to the page. We need to read the client ID from the URL, and we need to read the submitted data. Also, we need to check if the submitted data is valid or not. So we need to add this annotation and this object. Then we need to read the client having this ID from the database. So we can call our repository.getClient, and this is the client ID. So this is the client object, and if client is null, this means that we don't have a client with this ID. In this case, we can redirect the user to the list of clients. Otherwise, we will add the client object to the model, and if we have any validation error, then we will return the edit page. Otherwise, we need to update the client details in the database. So here we will update the client details using the submitted data that is available in client DTO. Then we can call repo.updateClient, and this is the client object. Then we will redirect the user to the list of clients. Now let's save the file. Let's update the details of this client, for example. So let's update the email address, the phone number, and the address. Then submit. And here we can see that the email address, the phone number, and the address have been updated. Now I will show you how to delete clients. So when we click on this delete button, we have this alert. If we click on cancel, nothing happens. And if we click on OK, we will send a request to the URL /clients/delete, and here we have the client ID. So now we need to create this route. So let's go to clients controller and let's create a new route. So we can create the method delete client. It will be accessible using the get method at the URL /clients/delete, and it requires the client ID. So here we will delete the client. So we can call our repository.deleteClient, and this is the client ID. Then we will redirect the user to the list of clients. Let's save the file. Let's go back to the list of clients and let's delete the first client, for example. So here we can see that the client with the ID 17 has been deleted. In the next video, I will show you how to implement the pagination functionality. You can find the video link in the description.